continuing class on Hebrews. Today we're going to be talking from Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to start out in verses 32 through 34. And we've been reading and looking at a bunch of examples and of the folks from the Old Testament and individuals, and then also as a group when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. And then this set of verses is going to start out with a list of a bunch of folks. And let's jump in. Hebrews 11, verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. And it starts out with this phrase, and what more shall I say? It's kind of like, it makes the point, we've already given you a whole bunch of examples of faith, and I don't need to sit here and give a lot of details on more and more and more. I can list some things, list some of the folks from the Old Testament, I can list some of the things they've done without going into as much detail. And so we recognize that you have these men that are listed, and then you've got the prophets, and that's going to bring you pretty much through the biblical history of Israel. You can see, if you want to look up Gideon, is covered in Judges chapter 6 through 8, Barak in Judges chapters 4 and 5, Samson in Judges 13 and 14, and Jephthah would be covered in Judges chapters 11 and 12. Of course, David and Samuel are of major significance in the Old Testament history. Samuel serves as the link between the judges and the monarchy, and David is the most outstanding representative that we would see of the monarchy of the kings. There are 9 statements in here of things, statements or achievements of faith, and we're going to look at these in 3 groups of 3. The first group marks things that were attained. They conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, and obtained promises. Those would be spiritual promises. These all happened during the time of David, but they also happened at other times in Israel's history. They enforced justice. David enforced justice, and they made it a working principle of their society to be a just society. Of course, we recently read about Abraham and his receiving God's promise. So those first 3 are things that were attained. The second group that are listed there is ways of endurance or deliverance, and that's the 3 are: they stopped the mouths of lions, they quenched the power of fire, and they escaped the edge of the sword. So of course they stopped the mouth of lions. We can think of some examples of that. One would be David in Daniel chapter 6, Samson in Judges chapter 14 verse 6, and then David in 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 34. And of course, in the case of Daniel, it was God who stopped the mouths of the lions there in Daniel chapter 6, but Daniel's faith is prominent in that account. The staying of lions by both Samson and David are examples, great examples of courage, which was fortified by faith. The next phrase was quench the power of fire. And from this account, we think of the 3 Hebrews in Daniel chapter 3. Again, what God was instrumental in doing is attributed to the faith of those 3 men who were miraculously delivered from the fire, didn't even have the smell of smoke on their clothes. And then the third example here is he escaped the edge of the sword. And this sums up a whole wide variety of violent action that happened, through the time of Israel. The third set is more positive. The third set of three is were made strong out of weakness, became mighty and in war, and put foreign armies to flight. Okay, the first one of those were made strong out of weakness, and this could be Hezekiah in Isaiah chapter 38, or Samson's last desperate act, as was viewed as an act of faith. Became mighty men of war, mighty men in war. Plays off the idea of strength gained from the weakness. We just talked about weakness. And this can be seen in David's time, and some of the statements that we read about how many people that David killed. It's further detailed in where it says, put foreign armies to flight. The military exploits of Israel were always related to the dependence on God. So all of these heroes of faith that we've talked about, all of them through this chapter of Hebrews, show a dependence on God. Now we're going to move on to the next section and see some examples of faith, and we're going to see those examples of endurance. So Hebrews chapter 11, verses 35 through 38. Beginning with verse 35. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword, they went about in the skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. So it starts out talking about women receiving back their dead by resurrection. And there's a couple of examples from the Old Testament we want to look at. If you would, turn in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 17. 1 Kings chapter 17, and beginning at verse 17, we're going to see where Elijah raises the widow's son. And a little earlier there in 1 Kings chapter 17, back in verse 12, you can read back up a little bit, and you'll see that it was a time of great drought, that there was this woman, and she was out gathering sticks, and she was going to make a fire. She had a handful of flour, she had a little bit of oil left, that's all she had, and it says that she was going to prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. So this was going to be her last, she had just enough for her last meal. But let's continue on in the account. Excuse me, a little time passes, and of course we know that Elijah, being there, that the oil didn't run out, the flour didn't run out, but time passes and her son becomes ill. So in 1 Kings chapter 17, and we'll begin at verse 17. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill, and his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." And he said to her, "Give me your son." And he took him from her arms and carried him up into the upper chamber where he lodged, and laid him on his own bed. And he cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourned by killing her son?" Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." And the Lord listened to the voices of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house, and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." And the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." So we see in this account the widow's son dies, and this is very tragic because being a widow, she doesn't have a husband to provide for her, but the hope would be that her son would be able to provide for her in her old age. And that being a problem more back then than now, they didn't have things like Social Security to take care of folks, so it would have been dependent on that son. And for him to die would have been a great loss to her directly, but it was going to be a long-term loss. So we see here that also that Elijah cries to the Lord, and it talks about that a couple times. And we see that when you have these Elijah and Elijah both cry out to the Lord and work on that. Now it did make the point that he took the boy up to his room, which is basically on the roof. It's kind of common design of homes back then. They had the inside, then you kind of went outside and went up to the roof. So he was in a separate place, and he took the boy up there, and then the boy was revived by God. And he brought him back down to the mother, and then of course she gives this statement of faith there. Let's turn over to 2 Kings now. 2 Kings chapter 4, if you would turn there in your Bible, and we're going to look at verses 18 through 44. And this is the account of where Elijah raises the Shunammite's son. So if you would turn to 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 18. When the child had grown, he went out one day to his father among the reapers, and he said to his father, "Oh, my head, my head." The father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother." And when he had lifted him and brought him to his mother, the child sat on her lap till noon. And then he died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and shut the door behind him and went out. Then she called to her husband and said, "Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may quickly go to the Son of God and come back again." And he said, "Why will you go to him today? It's neither new moon nor Sabbath." She said, "All is well." And it's interesting because more than once this Shunammite woman's going to say all is well, and obviously it's very far from well. The son's gone out to the field to his father. Some of the commentaries think that the son may have had a heat stroke and caused this big headache, but he passes out. He gets carried into his mother, and he dies. And then she wants to go see the man of God, but when asked, she said, "All is well." Let's continue on in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 24. Then she saddled the donkey, and she said to her servant, "Urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, if this was southern, it would be like Jihah, but that's not right. Gehazi, his servant, "Look, there is the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, 'Is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with your child?' And she answered, 'All is well.'" Again, she's like, "Everything's fine." And when things are not. Okay, my car warranty has expired. Sorry. And when she came to the mountain, after this, verse 27, and when she came to the mountain to the man of God, she caught hold of his feet, and Gehazi came to push her away. But the man of God said, "Leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." Again, she had hidden. She kept answering, "Everything's well." Then she said, "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" He said to Gehazi, tie up your garment and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. If anyone greets you, do not reply. And lay my staff on the face of the child. Then the mother of the child said, As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So he arose and followed her. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound or sign of life. Therefore he returned to meet him and told him, The child has not awakened. Verse 32. When Elijah came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on the bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. Then he went up and lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself upon him. The flesh of the child became warm. Then he got up again and walked once back and forth in the house, and went up and stretched himself upon him. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, Call the Shunammite. So he called her, and when she came to him, he said, Pick up your son. She came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. So in both of these cases, we see faith is exercised by the prophet and also by the women. It's worth noting that the women were in some way, or women are in some way implicated in all of the New Testament cases of rising from the dead as well. You've got the widow's son at Nain, the daughter of Jairus, and you've got Lazarus, who's the brother of Mary, and Martha of Bethany. One has to kind of wonder about that a little bit. Of course, Lazarus' account is in John chapter 11 and other places as well. We do see, and back in the account it uses the word by resurrection, or it means out of resurrection. And so this is the sphere from which dead emerge and come back to life. Interesting, Elijah and Elijah both begged God to restore life, but if you look at the accounts in the New Testament, Jesus is more commanding that. So you've got this catalog of feats of endurance, and it points to the character of the human spirit when it's faced with incredible odds. It requires an inner source of strength, and that source of strength obviously is God. Now back in Hebrews, we see a list of other things that some endured. It tells us some were tortured, and this draws attention to man's inhumanity to man. We're still not over this. There are places in the world now that torture is still used in some political systems. Thankfully, we live in a place that doesn't do that. And then this section here, because of the additional wording there where it talks about where they were, others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. We'll back up a little bit. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release. That's what I was looking for. And so the commentators look at this and say, this goes back to the Maccabean period, 2 Maccabees chapter 6, verse 18, where it has an account of some that refused to accept release, choosing to place their hope on a bodily resurrection, 2 Maccabees 7:9. The better life was in contrast to their continued earthly existence. So a lot of the commentators kind of point to this. Obviously, Maccabees isn't in our normal canon of Scripture, but people are familiar with that. Okay, now let's go on to others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. Of course, there's examples. You've got Jeremiah from the Old Testament, Paul from the New Testament. The readers of this book would have known people who had been in prison, so they would be familiar with that. The next phrase was they were stoned. this was a common form of capital punishment back then. Another phrase, they were sawn in two. And this is considered to be the tradition of Isaiah's death, and it's recorded by writers from that time. So, like many things, it wasn't that some magician thought this up, that being sawn in two actually comes from the Bible. Then it goes on to talk about they were killed by the sword. And of course, many folks then, that was a common form of death at the time, that folks would be killed with a sword. And we can see in 1 Kings chapter 19 verse 10 an example of that, where it tells us, he said, I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. So in this example we see where multiple prophets are killed by the sword. And then the verses there in Hebrews move on to examples of prolonged hardship. And they're kind of in a long, bad time. It talks about how they dressed. They dressed in skins of sheep and goats. They were destitute. They were afflicted, and they were mistreated. So they were basically poor enough that all they had for clothes was skins, and they had to make their own clothes from skins. And we know, or we read about skins of clothing. Elijah, that was pretty common for him. And of course, later on in the Bible, you'd read of John the Baptist and him dressing that way. And this is, it's not like they're trying to be this example of fashion. It's just basic clothes, where someone today might have a leather jacket, and that would be more of a very nice thing to have. Then it was like, this is all they had. So we see that they were destitute, afflicted, mistreated. It was a bad time. And then there's an interesting phrase there, of whom the world was not worthy. By comparison to the men of the world, in spite of their limited possessions and their low status, they're not inferior to the men of the world. These men of faith have it a lot better. They are more worthy, and they're worthy to God than someone that would have been at that time that just had material possessions. So let's continue on back in Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to read verses 39 through 40 to kind of finish out this chapter. But I will say that these verses here tie into the first part of chapter 12. So even though man has inserted a hard chapter break there, it really is kind of ties together. So Hebrews 11 verses 39 through 40. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. Okay, so we look at all of these accounts of trials and triumphs through faith, but then you come to the concluding statement that we as Christians have it better than they did. They did not have the promises of salvation like we as Christians have, and we have it better than that, than it was in the Old Testament. We're also, as it said, it uses the phrase that it's better, a better theme, and you see the better theme all through Hebrews, but also the phrase made perfect, which is another familiar idea that we have as we work through Hebrews. And again, better and perfect are going to just tie right in to the next section as we head into chapter 12. Now, I don't have slides here at home, but I would have shown you a new slide. We'll see it next week. Don't worry. We're exhorted to look to the examples of Christ as we move into chapter 12, and we're going to continue the thoughts of that last couple of verses, and then we're going to talk about discipline some. Discipline's essential for Christian life then, and it's essential for us now. There's going to be a strong plea to avoid moral inconsistency, and again, it's going to show the advantages the New Testament Christian has over the Old. We have the New Covenant, the better covenant. So let's read Hebrews chapter 12. Let's read the first couple verses. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So we just finished this chapter 11 where it talks about all of these heroes of faith, and then now it talks about them being spectators, and that we Christians, New Testament Christians, are in the arena, and these heroes are there as spectators. They're watching. So the focus shifts from kind of history, and the focus shifts forward to the present. And we see the values of the old, but we also see that the new is better. You know, we the Christians we're surrounded by the heroes of old. The word here could be martyrs or witnesses. Doesn't usually denote spectator, but we think about that they're there not just watching, but they're there for us. They're there to encourage us. And yet the use of the image here has this meaning that there's just more to it than just watching for entertainment. That they, again, their character is there as one of support. They're there to help inspire us. They bear witness to the faithfulness of God in sustaining them. They're there as encouragers to us, and they are there to help encourage those back that the book of Hebrews was written to. So it was written to these early Jews that became Christians, and it's to encourage them, but it's to encourage us as well. And the idea is kind of that there's this massive body of people that have gone on before us, and that we're surrounded. That might actually be a little bit creepy to think about, being surrounded, but we should be encouraged by that. And then this talks about running the race. And of course we see through the New Testament that we got to prepare for this Christian race. And it tells us to lay aside every weight. Now, if you were going to be in a race, say you're a runner, you're not going to go out to run a sprint wearing boots and heavy clothes. You know, you might find yourself in a position one day where you had to run with whatever you had, but if you're preparing for a race, you're going to lighten your load. Many years ago, we would do some amateur bike racing. And when you prepared for the bike race, you took, under the seat of your bicycle, usually you had a bag and it was full of tools in case your bike broke down when you're out riding on your own. And, to prepare for the race, you took those extra tools out, you removed that weight, you aired up the bike tires good and hard, and you put on your racing jersey and your racing shoes, and you got on your bike ready to run the race. One time in Chattanooga, we were preparing for a bicycle race, and one of our friends showed up with a bicycle that had a large rack on the back that you could carry a toddler or a small child in. And of course, we looked at that and thought, boy, that thing's big, that thing's heavy. That is not going to be competitive to show up with a bicycle that's weighted down. And we too need to think about being weighted down spiritually. The parallel here is where it talks about sin, which clings so closely. We're held back. We're slowed down spiritually by sin. It's not easy to get rid of. We have to repent. It wants to cling to us. It's like it's sticky. It's on you. And in many cases, we're going to cling to sin ourselves. And we need to put that aside. We need to lose that weight that's holding us back and letting us achieve our potential as Christians. It's a major impediment to our spiritual race. We have to leave it behind, put it away so that we can do our best as a Christian. We're told here in a positive way, we're encouraged to let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And there's an emphasis here in the Greek about action, which requires effort. You know, no athlete can expect to win without determination, without practice, without endurance. We have to prepare. We have to be able to work hard. We have to practice. We have to focus and keep our eyes on the goal. And the word here for discipline is also used in Hebrews chapter 10:36 and later in chapter 12 verse 3. And it's kind of the concept of submitting to discipline. As a Christian, we have to be disciplined. As an athlete, you have to be disciplined. You got to get up and you got to work and practice and focus, or you're not going to do well. And we've got to do that also to make sure we, again, eliminate sin in our lives. Note here it talks about the race that is set before us. It shows we don't get to pick our race. We get the race that's just laid out before us. The challenges that we're gonna face as we go through life as a Christian are different for every one of us. It's just what it's going to be. And my challenges, my Christian life is going to have different challenges than you do. We have the race that's set out before us, not that we don't get to pick. Another detail we have about the race here is it talks about as you look to Jesus. It tells us where we're supposed to look. In a race, you got to focus on the finish line. We can't be looking two places at the same time. And we need to look to Jesus for encouragement. We need to look to Jesus for help. We need to keep our eye on that finish line. We need to be focused on Jesus. And it tells us that Jesus, is the founder and perfecter of our faith, which means he's like the pioneer, but he's also the finisher. We need to focus on Jesus, focus on that finish line, focus on the goal, which is our eternal salvation. Then the scripture here links joy with suffering. And this is pretty common in the New Testament. You know, on the eve of his death, Jesus spoke of his joy and his desire for his disciples to share in his joy. We can see that in John chapter 15, verse 11. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. Or we can also read about it in John chapter 17, verse 13. But now I am coming to you, and these things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. Jesus knew what was set before him, the cross. We don't know what's set before us. We just talked about that. Our race is set before us. We don't get to pick it. We don't know what's coming next. But Jesus did know what was headed his way, and he knew that it was going to be pain, it was going to be suffering, but also it talked about despising the shame. Dying on the cross was typically something that was done to criminals, and so it was a shameful death at that time. Undoubtedly Jesus wasn't going to like the pain, but he was willing to do what God his Father wanted him to do. And then it goes on from there, of course, to he is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. We've seen this idea earlier in Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3, again in chapter 8 verse 1. Jesus' death on the cross was part of the pathway to that throne. It wasn't the end in itself. Otherwise, you'd be more focused on tragedy than triumph. Now we're going to go into a next section, which starts with consider him. And this means we need to have a careful assessment. We really need to focus here and not just casually think of it. Let's read in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 3 through 6. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted in your struggle against sin. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. So we need to consider, each aspect of the hostility that Christ had to endure to gain the full picture of what he went through. We need to keep our focus on Christ, and we need to do that so that we do not grow, as it says here, so that we may not grow weary or faint-hearted. It's human nature to kind of lose heart. It's human nature to kind of lose focus, and we can do that over time. And here it's telling us we need to be focused so that we're not going to grow weary or faint-hearted. And we need to look at Christ's example of what he went through. Again, we're not going to be, we're going to have struggles and we're going to have resistance, but it says here, not resistance to the point of shedding blood. In some cases, there may be, this kind of links to the thought of the arena, where they might be in the arena at that point and faced with the shedding of their blood. And that kind of ties in too of the thought of all of the witnesses, all of those early examples of faith there at the arena, watching and encouraging. And it also ties in with the concept here, the analogy to the race, and you have the arena and the race going on. We don't have the risk today that they had. We're not facing the sword, and hopefully we never do here in America. We definitely won't in my lifetime. So in a way, we don't have it that bad. We don't have it as bad as they did. Back in verse 5, it talks about the question as sort of, have you forgotten specifically? And then it's going to quote from Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. And the son from Proverbs is applied to Christians who receive this Hebrews letter. And this applies to us very much today. The level of discipline that we may have received as a child, nowadays some people might consider the discipline that we grew up with as abusive. It's just the way things change a little bit. Discipline's never pleasant, and one does need to understand what's motivating discipline. We're going to get into discipline more in the next section, and we'll talk about that next week. There in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 7 through 11. And I'd like for you to think about discipline. It's never pleasant to receive at the time. We tend to learn from it. It's not really pleasant for most folks to dish it out as a parent, but we do need to be mindful as a parent that is something that we have to do, and if we don't, we're really doing a disservice to our children if we don't raise them up properly and with discipline, with appropriate discipline. And so think about that. Read this next section, Hebrews 12, 7 through 11, and think about discipline next week, not only as a parent view, but also as we receive it, and what it applies to us as Christians and God's discipline for us. Thank you. Sorry for the couple of little distractions this week, but we hope to see you in person next week.